Hey guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I'm here to discuss period 5, which is 1844 to 1877. A very small time frame, yes, but very mighty and a lot happening in our nation's history. So to begin, our first big picture story is Westward Expansion. Westward expansion becomes the driving force of many political debates in the mid 1800s because when we acquire new territory, the number one question is, will that new territory permit slavery? So this all begins really under the driving force of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that America is destined to expand as a nation from coast to coast. And so, as I mentioned, this is the driving force of a lot of our decision making in the 1800s. Manifest destiny is often symbolized here by Lady Columbia, bringing telegraph wires, covered wagons, and railroads with her out west. It begins with the annexation of Texas. If you guys recall, Texas was once controlled by Mexico. They invited American settlers to settle in Texas, and we were able to declare Texas eventually as an independent nation. Over the next few years, there was a lot of hesitancy in our government whether or not we should permit Texas as a state, because if we did, Texas would primarily be a slave state. And so we are able to kind of stave off the annexation of Texas until 1846. But as soon as we do that, we find ourselves embroiled in conflict with Mexico once again, as there was a dispute over the boundary lines between Texas and Mexico once Texas became an American state. And so from 1846 to 1848, we are at war with Mexico. Oh, sorry about that. And ultimately, when that war ends, we acquire a ton of territory. This is known as the Mexican Cession, and the territory was acquired under the official peace treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It gave us primarily the southwest portion of the United States today. And of course, the number one question was, should we permit slavery in this territory? A congressman named David Wilmot proposed the Wilmot Proviso after we acquired this territory, suggesting that this territory should indeed be free of slavery, but that proviso did not pass both houses of Congress. On top of that, we are looking elsewhere for territory. And you guys may recall hearing the slogan 54-40 or fight. This specifically refers to the Oregon territory. And James K. Polk and the Democrats basically said that they would be willing to fight for this territory and take it all the way up to the southern border of Alaska. So think about it, Oregon, Washington, and even parts of Canada. They eventually relented and settled on the 49th parallel, which brought us present day Oregon and Washington, and very fertile land that a lot of settlers migrated to in the mid 1800s. We also, in 1849, see the California Gold Rush, which, as you guys may recall, there were specks of gold found at Sutter's Mill outside of present-day San Francisco, and it drove a massive number of primarily young men to California hoping to strike it rich. While many did not make money actually finding gold, the people that sold the materials to pan for gold, whether it was pans, picks, shovels, etc., were the ones that really made the money. But of course, as we populate these new territories, once again, the question becomes, will these territories permit slavery? And this really brings us right to the road to the Civil War. So from approximately 1850 to 1861, our country sees a barrage of compromises, many of which that fail, publications, and very violent events. And as you can see, the decade prior to the Civil War is one of expansion, failed compromises, the question of morality and states' rights. So we're going to break this down. First and foremost, when it comes to the expansion of slavery, and this carries over from the last story, there are certain events and compromises that question how far slavery should expand. We know that up until this point, our country tried to strike a balance between the same number of free states and slave states, but we have events like the Compromise of 1850, which tries to continue that trend by allowing California as a free state. The South, in return, was given the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically said that any slave that ran north, authorities in the North had to help apprehend those slaves. The Dred Scott decision, which is a very important Supreme Court case in 1857, questions whether or not slaves have their freedoms if they travel to free territories. And that Supreme Court decision was considered a victory for slave owners when the Supreme Court said essentially that Congress cannot legislate slavery in free territories, and that slaves specifically have no business bringing a lawsuit in a court of law. There are also things that happen that cause many Americans to question the morality of slavery. Publications like Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book by Harriet Beecher Stowe that essentially questions the morality and treatment of slaves, is one that riles up both Northerners and Southerners alike. Kind of in response to that, there are publications by George Fitzhugh, who essentially argued that Blacks were morally inferior to whites, and that it was really the duty of slave owners to take care of their slaves. That's called paternalism, and that ultimately slaves had better conditions than perhaps white factory workers. On top of that, again, there are a series of failed compromises. I already mentioned the Compromise of 1850, but in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act brought up the question of popular sovereignty. Maybe instead of trying to maintain a balance between slave and free states, what we could do is we could leave it up to the people. And that's called popular sovereignty. So as you can see from that second photo, you've got the Kansas and Nebraska territories in red. The Nebraska territory was far enough north that ultimately, they would vote to maintain a free status. But since Kansas was kind of right in that hot spot and right in the middle, you saw many Americans move to Kansas in the hopes of outvoting one another. And as we know, this turns into a very violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. And instead of, popular sovereignty driving the decision, Kansas essentially was a place filled with violence. This will also open the door to the creation of the Republican Party in 1854, which I'll speak more about in a second. On top of that, as if the road to the Civil War wasn't complicated enough, many people question states' rights. Who should have the power to determine whether or not slavery should be permitted? And this is where you start to see names like John C. Calhoun, right, who really argued that slavery was a positive good for the South. And we see, once again, this ability of Southern states to nullify federal laws when South Carolina becomes the first state to secede or leave the Union after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Again, there's a lot on this slide, you guys, and I hope you can see just how complicated the path to the Civil War is, but there are a lot of questions about where slavery should be permitted, whether or not this is morally the correct thing to do, a series of compromises that fail, where does states' rights come into play, and of course, on top of that, you have just this huge sectional divide in the United States that's been growing and growing and growing really for decades. All of this comes to a head with the Civil War, which takes place from 1861 to 1865. We know that the war itself is much longer than anticipated. The secession of the southern states led to the creation of the Confederate States of America, led by Jefferson Davis. And the North and the South engaged in incredibly bloody and brutal battles for those first couple years of the war. Even though the North was much better outfitted and had the manpower and had the materials and the supplies and the railroads, they didn't anticipate that the Confederate soldiers would fight as hard as they did, and that, once again, this war lasted much longer than anyone had anticipated. Two things that happen in the war that are pretty crucial is that the Battle of Antietam allows for Abraham Lincoln to pass the Emancipation Proclamation, which declares slaves in rebelling territory to be free. As we know, this really isn't a logical thing that can happen. It's almost physically impossible to go into the South and free all of the slaves. But the Emancipation Proclamation, really changes the conversation, and the Civil War really becomes the war to, at this point, end slavery. And it is believed that the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation kept Great Britain out of the Civil War and kept them from supplying and supporting the South because they didn't want to get embroiled in a conflict over slavery. On top of that, the Battle of Gettysburg leads to the very famous Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, in which he invokes the words of our founding fathers and talks about how, we will create a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and that the lives that had been lost during the Civil War were not lost in vain. The Civil War eventually ends in April of 1865 when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And of course, we don't know for certain what the end of the war would have looked like, as well as Reconstruction, due to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln about a week later. And so that brings us to our third big picture story, and that's how do we rebuild this nation, and how do we bring southern states back into the Union? What do we do with these newly emancipated slaves? And how do we, rebuild as a nation? So first and foremost, this is known as the Reconstruction time period, which is approximately 1865 to 1877, though the effects of Reconstruction reach far beyond the year 1877. Right off the bat, we often point to the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the 13th, which abolishes slavery, the 14th, which grants citizenship to these newly freed slaves, and the 15th, which grants voting rights to African American males. On top of that, there are some congressional programs like the Freedmen's Bureau who try and supply newly freed slaves with social services, money, food, etc., as well as create educational opportunities. The future of these newly freed slaves is protected as well by the radical Republicans in Congress who want to see full civil rights achieved for these emancipated slaves, and they are led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. However, unfortunately, many slaves fall into a system known as sharecropping, where they continue to work the land for their former owners, or perhaps for a new tenant or a new landowner, But ultimately, they're given a small portion of the land, and they agree to, continue to plant cash crops like cotton, but have to essentially borrow money to pay for equipment, housing, materials, etc. And so this system of sharecropping keeps many freed African Americans in a cycle of poverty. On top of that, you have a very strong reaction from many Southerners to these new Reconstruction amendments and freedoms. It's right after the Civil War that we see the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, which is created in Tennessee, and specifically to try and strike fear and intimidation into the hearts of African Americans and prevent them specifically from voting and taking advantage of these new freedoms. On top of that, speaking of voting rights, many Southern states implement literacy tests and poll taxes and other obstacles to make taking advantage of voting more difficult. Many Southern states also implement things like black codes, which try to limit the freedoms of African Americans economically, and Jim Crow laws, which try to segregate blacks and whites in public. And on top of that, we usually point to the Compromise of 1877 as kind of the end of Reconstruction, though arguably the impact continues on for the next 100 years. The Compromise of 1877 allows for Rutherford B. Hayes to assume the presidency, and in exchange for the presidency, he pulls federal troops out of the South, and so the South kind of reverts back to all of these actions that are listed above. So again, even though Reconstruction ends in 1877 on paper, that discrimination and those obstacles and challenges will continue to be faced by African Americans, and it'll be almost 100 years later that the civil rights movement will address some of those very issues.